Hello and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Please sign up at my Patreon to get episodes earlier, bonuses, to have a say on future content, and to interact with me and other Warbirders directly. But mainly you'll have the satisfaction of helping keep this podcast going. You can also toss me a tip via PayPal at WOWB17, or even just drop me a review. Thank you for your support. Now on to the show. Hello Warbirders. At the end of the Bolton Paul Defiant episode, I teased that I was thinking of doing a more, in quotes, popular aircraft. And I settled on the P-47. Everybody loves the Jug, the Thunderbolt. Debating the Razorback versus the Bubble Canopy. Debating the Jug versus the Mustang. So I was just going to jump right into that. But the problem with the story of some of these warbirds, though, is that they are very much an evolution. One bird begats another, and so on. So here we begin a series I'm calling Thunderstorm. And just as an approaching storm begins with distant rumbles and far-off flashes, the P-47 story is going to begin small and far away, and build to a mighty tempest. No, I'd better not use that word, or you'll get confused by the Hawker Tempest. And build to a mighty gale. Good enough. Let's dive in. Ever heard of Alexander Nikolaevich de Seversky? I have to admit that before starting my research on this one, I hadn't. But I'm glad that I discovered him because he has quite the story. Born into the nobility in what was then Imperial Russia in 1894, de Seversky was raised in a family where aviation wasn't just a curiosity, it was practically a destiny. His father owned one of the very first private airplanes in Russia, a rather fragile-looking Blériot monoplane, but young Alexander was hopelessly infected with the aviation bug. His father had already taught him how to fly even before he entered the Imperial Russian Naval Academy in 1910. When the Great War broke out in 1914, de Seversky was selected by the Imperial Russian Navy as a pilot, and soon found himself flying reconnaissance and bombing missions over the Baltic. It didn't take long for him to make a name for himself, but not before suffering a terrible crash. On one of his early missions, an attack on a German destroyer, his aircraft was hit by enemy fire and crashed into the sea. His observer was killed, but de Seversky survived. But he lost his right leg. For most people, that would have been the end of their flying career. Not for Alexander de Seversky. He had a prosthetic leg fitted, trained himself to walk, and then insisted on getting back in the cockpit. The official answer was "Niet," and so de Seversky decided to show them that he was airworthy. De Seversky appeared unannounced at an air show and borrowed a plane. Following his impromptu, spirited aerial performance, he was arrested. None other than Tsar Nicholas II himself personally intervened on de Seversky's behalf, and in July 1916, de Seversky returned to combat duty. Maybe the Tsar thought that the damned one-legged fool would just get himself killed and solve the problem. Nope. On his third day back, he got his first kill. In February 1917, he took command of the 2nd Naval Fighter Detachment, but then was involved in an accident where a horse-drawn wagon rolled over his leg. His good leg, and he got grounded again. Once he recovered, he went back to active duty. He was shot down behind enemy lines and walked back, obviously made much more difficult by his bum legs. By the time the conflict ended, he had flown 57 combat missions and shot down 6 German aircraft and was highly decorated. In March 1918, he was selected for a plum position as an assistant naval attaché in the Russian naval aviation mission to the United States. While in the U.S., he decided to stay there rather than return to a Russia torn apart by the revolution. He also left the de in his name back in Russia. Settling down in Manhattan, he ran a restaurant for a time. Imagine if he had just settled for that, serving New York's best piroshkis. But he had a relentless energy and a mind that simply couldn't stop thinking about airplanes. He soon found his way into working for the U.S. government as a technical advisor and a test pilot, and quickly made friends in high places, including none other than General Billy Mitchell, who recognized in Seversky a man who thought boldly and didn't shy away from controversy. He became kind of the Thomas Edison of the aeronautical invention world, applying for and receiving the first patents for air-to-air refueling in 1921, as well as 362 more patent claims. Among them, the first gyroscopically stabilized bomb sight, which Seversky developed with the Sperry Gyroscope Company. In 1923, he sold his bomb sight patent to the U.S. government and used the $50,000, which would be about $1 million today, to found the Seversky Aero Corporation. He also joined the Army Air Corps Reserve and was commissioned a major in 1928. The stock market crash of 1929 bankrupted the company. But I think you've come to expect more from our hero, and yes, 2 years later, with the financial backing of Wall Street millionaire Edward Moore and other investors, the new Seversky Aircraft Corporation was born in Long Island, New York. The company settled into the former Edo Aircraft Corporation's float plane factory and started building their own planes. Seversky had become a passionate advocate for modernizing the U.S. Air Corps. He believed that the days of wood and fabric biplanes were over, and that the future belonged to sleek, all-metal monoplanes with retractable landing gear and enclosed cockpits. These were radical ideas at the time, and he pushed them with the zeal of a man who had already bet his life on aviation more than once. But he had help too. He had brought on board another expat named Alexander. Alexander Kardveli was a Georgian, you know, the Eastern European type of Georgian, not the Southern U.S. kind, who had graduated in 1922 from the Institut Supérieur de l'Aéronautique et de l'Espace en Paris. He started as a test pilot, but was seriously injured during a test flight, which ended his flying career. But he transitioned to designing and bounced around from Blériot to the Atlantic Aircraft Corporation in New York to finally land with Seversky as his chief designer. They developed a new prototype, the Seversky SEV-3. I'll post a pic on Patreon, but the DNA of the P-47 is totally there. Think of a P-47 shaped aircraft on floats, and there you go. The SEV-3 was an all-metal cantilever. Remember that this means no struts or wires supporting the wing. Low-wing monoplane. Powered by a nose-mounted 420 horsepower Wright J6 Whirlwind radial engine. It had 2 cockpits in tandem. The one in the front was for the pilot, and there was a rear one for 2 passengers. I had mentioned floats, but it was actually an amphibian, with main wheels fitted in the floats to allow it to operate from land also. Or it could be fitted with a fixed undercarriage, with the main wheels enclosed in huge fairings in the style of the 1930s. A handful of them were built for evaluation as trainers or transports, but the type's main attribute would be as a stepping stone to future designs. It was used to set numerous speed records at the 1933 to 1939 National Air Races, often piloted by Seversky himself, who became the company's greatest pitchman. By setting records and performing stunts, he and his company hoped to win the attention of the Army Air Corps. On September 15, 1935, flying at a speed of just over 230 miles per hour, Seversky set a world speed record for piston-engine amphibious aircraft. He also set a transcontinental speed record in 1938. Always the genius innovator, Seversky himself ran the Seversky Aircraft Design Office, which was kind of a sub-company within the company, kind of like the future Lockheed Skunk Works. Seversky was personally responsible for 25 different imaginative projects, many of them commercially doomed, such as the Seversky Super Clipper, an 8-engine transoceanic transport with a 250-foot wingspan. Seversky may have been a brilliant visionary and a capable pilot, but he was not a calm or easygoing businessman. He was fiery, outspoken, and famously impatient with bureaucracy, which sometimes got him into trouble. But his luck was holding out. Because you see, out of all the scattershot Seversky ideas, one was a hit. The SEV-3 had morphed into a 2-seat land fighter derivative called the SEV-2XP. The fixed landing gear was replaced with a retractable undercarriage, where the main wheels folded backwards into the wing, and a much more powerful 735 horsepower Wright R1820 radial engine had been added. It was now armed with 150 and 130 caliber forward-firing machine gun, plus a 30 caliber gun in the back for rear defense. The U.S. Army Air Corps had announced a competition for a new single-seat fighter back in 1935, and Seversky had sent the SEV-2XP, being so confident in it that it would win despite it being a 2-seater. It crashed en route. But the other competitor, Curtiss, was also having trouble, and so the competition was delayed until they could both get their ducks in a row. In April 1936, the competition was finally held with the addition of submissions from both Vought and Consolidated. But the Seversky model won, earning it an order for 77 fighters and spare parts equivalent to 8 more airplanes, being placed at a cost of $1,600,000. The new fighter was dubbed the P-35. A navalized version was even tried out against the Brewster Buffalo and Grumman F-4F, but was found unsatisfactory. But the P-35 was going into service. But before we get into the operational service of the P-35, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about another remarkable aviation storytelling podcast called So There I Was. If you're a fan of flying, and you must be if you're listening to me, or if you just love a good story told by the people who were really there, this is one that you'll want to check out. It's hosted by 2 former U.S. Marine pilots, Fig and Repeat, who bring you first-hand accounts from men and women who've lived through the highs and lows of aviation. Each episode feels like you've just pulled up a bar stool after a long flight. The stories are told with humor, honesty, and the kind of detail that only pilots can share. You'll hear from fighter pilots, astronauts, Blue Angels, carrier captains, Coast Guard rescue crews, and many more. Some of them have stared death in the face. Others have fought their way back from incredible odds just to keep flying. You'll experience the thrill of being shot off the deck of a carrier, the terror of a night landing in stormy seas, or the quiet loneliness of drifting in a life raft under a dark sky. It's storytelling that puts you right there in the cockpit. Tanner and I particularly loved the OV-10 Bronco episode called Squints and Moles, and the one about flying the U-2 and the Bone, the B-1 bomber. Each story is unique and told with a level of detail that makes you feel like you were there. You'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll laugh until you cry, but one thing is certain, you won't be bored. So there I was. It's how all great aviation tales begin. Subscribe today at sothereiwas.us. So the P-35 went operational in 1937. And for a brief, shining moment, it was arguably the most advanced fighter the United States had ever fielded. It was sleek, smooth-skinned, and about as modern as anything flying in the mid-1930s. It looked every inch the thoroughbred. The first examples went to the First Pursuit Group at Selfridge Field, Michigan, where pilots were thrilled to finally trade in their open cockpit biplanes for something that looked like the future. But in that era, the future arrived faster than anyone expected. Across the Atlantic, aircraft like the Hawker Hurricane and the Messerschmitt Bf-109 were already proving that the cutting edge was moving forward at a blistering pace. And the P-35, with its fixed-pitch propeller, modest engine, and non-self-sealing fuel tanks, was already and quickly showing its age. Still, for the late 1930s, it was a valuable transition design, and not just for the designing engineers. The pilots learned how to handle retractable gear, manage higher landing speeds, and operate in enclosed cockpits. All things that would become second nature to the next generation of fighter pilots. At its peak, the P-35 equipped several squadrons of the 1st and 27th Pursuit Groups and later saw service in training and secondary roles. Its solid, forgiving handling made it popular with instructors. Seversky, always on the hunt for a publicity stunt, entered versions of the P-35 in air races and built a civilian aircraft called the DS, or Doolittle Special for James Doolittle, employed at the time by the Shell Oil Company. Another version was used by Jacqueline Cochran to win the 1938 Bendix Trophy race and set a women's air speed record. When the war clouds began to gather, Seversky, ever the hungry salesman, looked abroad for buyers. Sweden was particularly interested and ordered 120 improved versions with better armament and a more powerful Pratt & Whitney R1830 engine. 60 of them actually made it to Sweden before the U.S. embargoed fighter aircraft export sales, where they served as the J-9 in the Swedish Air Force, operating as interceptors and patrol aircraft throughout the early years of the war. They were reliable, sturdy machines, easy to maintain and surprisingly fast for their time, though by 1942 they were thoroughly outclassed by faster, cannon-armed opponents. The leftover Swedish-ordered aircraft became known as the P-35A. The remaining 60, as fate would have it, were diverted to the U.S. Army Air Corps, painted in olive drab, and shipped out to the Philippines in 1941 to bolster American defenses in the Pacific. And that's where the P-35 met its moment in history and its tragic finale. When the Japanese attacked the Philippines just hours after Pearl Harbor, the 24th Pursuit Group's P-35As were among the first American fighters to scramble. They were brave pilots, flying aircraft that, by that point, were hopelessly outdated. Against nimble Zeros and Ki-43 Oscars, the old Severskys were outgunned, outturned, and outclimbed. Many were destroyed on the ground in the opening attacks. The few that got airborne fought valiantly but suffered heavy losses. Some pilots managed to score hits, even a few kills, but the outcome was never in doubt. By early 1942, most surviving P-35As had been shot down, wrecked, or captured. The Japanese, ever resourceful, actually repaired several and flew them for evaluation. So operationally, the P-35's record might look modest, even tragic, but that doesn't tell the full story. This was the bridge between two eras, from the open cockpit biplane fighters of the 1920s to the sleek, high-performance machines of World War II. The lessons learned from the P-35 directly shaped the designs of the next in our series, the P-43 Lancer. But we're not quite there yet. What happened to Seversky and his company? Well, even with the success of the P-35, the company was never able to turn a profit under Seversky's management, and by September 1938, the company went bankrupt again and had to be bailed out again. But this time, the investors made sure that Seversky was on a shorter leash with a reduced budget. And the board of directors made sure that more power was transferred to managing director Wallace Kellett. Seversky had even ticked off the War Department with a controversial secret contract Seversky quietly negotiated with the Japanese for the sale of 20 fighters. So, when salesman and pitchman Seversky took off for Europe on a sales tour in the winter of 1938 to 1939, the board took the opportunity to reorganize the company, even going so far as to rename it as the Republic Aviation Corporation, with Kellett being promoted to the new president. Seversky was out. He sued, but Republic Aviation would go on without him. Ugh, that must have hurt. But he stayed busy. He wrote a book in April 1942 called Victory Through Air Power. It went number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list and stayed there for 4 weeks with 5 million copies sold. Walt Disney actually adapted it into an animated motion picture in 1943 of the same name, where Seversky himself provided live-action commentary. In his later life, Seversky continued to lecture and write about aviation and the strategic use of air power. He died in 1974 and was buried in the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. One P-35 U.S. Army Air Corps version is preserved at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. A Swedish export version is on display at the Flygvapen Museum, Swedish Air Force Museum, in Linköping, Malmslätt. I apologize for all of that. So, as I hinted before, the next in our Thunderstorm series will be a look at the Republic P-43 Lancer. Sorry, Seversky. If the P-35 was the cumulus cloud buildup of a storm, the P-43 Lancer would be the fully fledged cumulonimbus that would play a much greater role in World War II and lead directly to the devastating flash of the Thunderbolt. If you get some satisfaction out of listening to this show, please consider supporting me at World of Warbird's Patreon. It's only $5 a month. There are advantages to being a supporting patron of the podcast, such as getting the episodes a week earlier and bonus episodes. You get a greater say in future content, and you're able to interact with me directly. But mainly, you've got the satisfaction of keeping this podcast going. If you're presently listening to this through Patreon, well, thank you for your support. You can also toss me a quick tip via PayPal at WOWB17, or just give me a review. It all helps. I appreciate it more than you know. Until next time.